the first thing I want to put up here is a warning. Part of this presentation, guys, you're probably not going to agree with. I've done this long enough, been in the extension long enough that there's going to be, especially when I get to some of the hay production side of it, that you're probably going to not want to agree or not believe what I'm going to throw up there. And so I'm fine with that. You may not agree or you might not believe it, but the numbers that I'm using are either assumed numbers or averages from other similar operations. And since there are no two operations that are same, I suggest or even tell you to go ahead and use your own numbers. Come up with your own numbers and calculate your production cost. I think you'll find out that we're not very far off, and I'm a little closer to right than I am to wrong. But I always challenge people, when I start talking about this and they don't want to believe me, it's like, well, what are your numbers? And generally that's the case. Is a lot of times they're not aware of their numbers, so it's kind of hard to put that into perspective. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is a lot of what I'm going to discuss today. It can be found in the Oklahoma Forage and Pasture Fertility Guide. It's a publication that Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service come out with. Golly, Brian, I think that's about 7-8 years ago now. Got updated some time ago. If you want a copy of this, I believe you can contact your county extension educator and get you a copy. I don't think there's a charge for it. I could be wrong, but if it is a charge, it's not very much. So let's get to the talk here. Here's what I'm going to disagree with you. Brian said 45 to 50% of the cost in raising cattle is in feed costs, and he did right. He talked about when we call feed, we talk about not only feed we pour out of the bag, but grass and everything. I'm going to tell you it's closer to 70%, somewhere between 60 and 70%. And so today I pulled out the latest Kansas farm management data. They put out a report just about every year. They're about a couple years behind. This data uses 2014 and 18 data. And what this graph kind of shows you here is on the left here, that's all the farms that they did. And you can see that 68% of the cost, and then 43 or 44% of that is feed cost, okay? And then about 24% of that is what we call pasture cost. But you total those up, those come up to 68%. The three columns to the right of that are what they classify as the high third profitability. So the column right here, these are the guys that are making money. Okay, they're the ones that are making money. The middle ones are probably breaking even. The guys here on the end, they're the ones that are losing money that we're talking about, doing cow-calf operations. And the one thing I want you to notice that the percentage rarely changes, actually kind of goes up a little bit for the profit guys, goes up closer to 70%. But the numbers that you really want to focus on is when you look at the percentage that they spend on feed. So the high profit guys only spend about 41% or $281 per cow on feed, whereas the guys breaking even, that jumps up quite a bit, 339, jumps up even higher. So and then you look at the pasture costs. Actually, the pasture cost is higher than the average cost for the guys. So the guys that are making money spend more money on their pastures and raising that grass and growing grass and then feeding that grass to those cows. Whereas you look at the other ones, they're spending less money and actually quite a bit lower percentage of their money goes into that pasture cost. And yet, is there a correlation between their, making money and the money that they're spending on this? I'll argue that there is. And so that, these guys, that make money, they've learned how to efficiently use their pastures and put the money there into those pastures. And so the one thing also I want you to notice down here, the yellow bar is machinery cost. And so these guys that are making money have a whole lot lower machinery cost per cow than what these other two do. And so kind of goes into the talk I'm going to talk about today. So when we go on, so my theme for today, production is important, no doubt about it. You cannot sell if you don't raise it. And then marketing, I'm going to tell you that marketing is important, and we usually do a poor job on marketing and stuff. But Brian kind of hit on this when he did his talk. The controlling our cost is the critical part in a cow-calf operation. That's the low-hanging fruit, the point that we're the piece of the operation that we can actually do more good. If we can control costs, it'll actually make us more money then, you talked about increasing weaning weights by 40 something pounds. It's easier to control costs than it is actually to increase weaning weights by that much. And we can do that so easily if we just put a sharp pencil and do some thinking about it. Now, the one thing that when I always talk about controlling costs, that I kind of get, the thought of, or what people kind of take away, a message that I don't want them to take away is, oh, so you mean controlling costs? So when fertilizer or medicines get high, I should just cut those out, and not do those. No, that's not what we're talking about. Controlling costs is not eliminating those costs that generate us a high return. It's eliminating those costs that don't generate us the highest return. So don't think that I'm talking about, getting rid of, doing something, eliminating it. That cost actually generates us a higher return and more efficient. So with that all said, that's the theme for the day. The topics that I'm going to talk about today, is first off, forage production costs. We're going to talk about fertilizer and weed control. I only have a little short window of time. I can't get into everything, so I kind of cherry picked what the two ones that I thought were pretty the most important. We're going to talk about forage storage cost, and then when I call it storage, hay harvesting is we're storing that forage so we can use it another time. And then we're going to talk about storage methods, how we store that after we harvest it and stuff. And then we got the forage feeding cost. I'm going to get a little bit into the quality versus quantity debate. I'm going to get a little bit into feeding methods and how we feed this hay when we do feed hay to them. And then Brian's already done a really great job on reducing feeding days. And so I'm probably going to just gloss over that really quick. So that's the topics for today. So let's jump into the first thing is important, what I think is important information, because we're going to talk about fertilizer first. And the first thing I'm going to suggest to you is soil testing. And when producers start talking about doing fertilization and doing this type of programs that Brian's talked about, I think before the first thing you ought to do first is pull a soil test, because without a soil test, in my opinion, you're trying to hit a target in a dark room. You may get lucky, you may hit it right on, but chances are you're going to miss. And we're talking about $10, and so it's not a great expense. And for $10, and especially today's fertilizer prices, we'll make that $10 back really, really easy by just doing a simple soil test. And again, it's not that difficult to do. Trust me, if I can do it, and guys, I did not have a single agronomy class going through school. I did all the animal science and all the ag econ stuff. And so if I can do this simple task, anybody can do this. And then the other thing that I think about, seems like to me a lot of times producers get really hung up on producing grass without really knowing what their forage needs are. And so I'm talking simple about just do a simple forage budget. So determine what you need, determine the amount of grass, the amount of forage that you need to run your cows. And we don't need to produce more than that. There's no reason to have, a barn full of hay sitting on May 15th when the cows are going out to green grass. Now, we talk about storage costs and opportunity costs. There's such a pile of money in a barn that we may or may not get any benefit from it. And so I'm a big proponent. I'm not saying we don't need to have some excess supply and storage, but I've known producers to have 2 years worth of hay, in storage waiting for the next drought. And so I'm not a real big proponent. We could better use that money somewhere else. So talk about why we produce forage. There's basically 2 reasons, guys. One, we're going to sell it as hay. And if you're doing this, and I don't want to hurt your feelings on this deal, but please make sure that whatever price you charge is covering all the costs, not only the cash costs. And then I know sometimes, if we're baling a lot of hay, maybe on the shares for people and stuff, the cash costs, think we don't have anything in it, but there's money in it in non-cash expenses, the machinery cost. And that's the cost that we don't really see. We paid for it when we bought the equipment, and we really don't see it on a yearly basis. But have an idea what the non-cash expense was, because you want to cover those expenses, because when it becomes time to replace that machinery, you want the money in the bank to do that. But I'm gonna talk more about the input as a livestock production, hay or pasture. And I think we should view this as any other input. People all the time go to the county office and they ask about, what's the cheapest thing I can feed, or what, the most economical and do this. But a lot of times they forget about the hay or the pasture. And so we should view that as any other input and measure it and try to get again, I don't want to use the word cheap because cheap is not always the best, but we want to try to produce it the most economically we can. And I say a lot of times that we just don't do that. We just kind of gloss over that. And then we want to try to figure out the best ways to be efficient. And a lot of times efficient and the right word I'm looking for is convenient. Efficiency and convenience don't really go in the same sentence. And so a lot of times we do what convenient is to us, and maybe not the most efficient way of doing things. And so we got to evaluate that. And then the one thing that I always talk to producers, and this is not a very popular subject with people, because everybody thinks that if I'm in the cattle business, I should have a tractor, I should have a baler, I should have all the necessary equipment. I dare to kind of point out to you that you maybe should evaluate the cost of producing your forage versus buying your forage. And we live in a state that is blessed with amount of people putting up hay for sale, and usually we can buy the hay a lot cheaper than we can produce it. And there are some problems and some issues with that, but there's easy solutions for that. So I always think people should evaluate that before they go buy that trailer and that baler and that mowing machine. So what are the costs when we talk about producing forage? Okay, this is not rocket science. First thing is establishment. Now, I know most of y'all guys probably have Bermuda grass. It's been there forever, and so you didn't pay to establish it the first time. But if you're going to try to introduce something such as Bermuda or fescue, either Kentucky 31 or the end-of-fight friendly versions, hay grass, whatever you want to do, there is a cost for establishment. The thing about what we got to remember is what's that cost? And so usually, it doesn't really matter which grass you're going to pick. It's going to be somewhere around 200, could be up as high as 3, maybe 3.5 an acre. And it does, really truthfully, $400 an acre is not expensive if we can get that stand to last. And so I always say the rule of thumb for fescue grass is that we need it to last 4 years to make it pay for itself. So if it lasts 2, that may be a pretty expensive option, but if we can get it to last 5, 6, 7, then it pays for itself pretty easy. But we got to think about that before we put that in, and that's where you talk to people like Brian and your county educators to figure out what grasses grow. We don't want to try to grow something here in Oklahoma that's not going to grow very well. So the one thing that most people talk about is fertilizer. How much fertilizer costs, it's going to depend on how much is needed and the costs. And we're going to get into the fertilizer conversation really big here in just a second. So we'll go on. And the next thing is weed control. And again, what are you trying to control? If you're trying to control something pretty easy, the 2,4-D will get, control. It's pretty cheap. But if we're trying to control something else that, we got to go to Cimarron Max or some other type of chemical, and it gets kind of expensive. And we'll talk a little bit about weed control, but the big cost is the harvest cost. When we talk about this, hardest number to get a handle on. We'll dive into it just a little into it. And this is where I usually get the most people arguing or not arguing, but not wanting to agree with me, or they don't think my numbers are right. But because the reason why it's so hard to figure out is because it all depends on the number of acres and the age and type of equipment. And I should put in there, how good of a mechanic are you? I am not that mechanically inclined. I can do some things, but there's some things I can't. And so, how many, if I have to pay somebody to keep things together. And then I know some producers that they want to trade machines out on a fairly regular basis. And so this all goes into our harvest costs. And we'll talk more about that here in just a second. So let's get into the fertilizer discussion. Okay. So what I've done, and I did this back in 06 and 07 when the fertilizer jumped way high, and people kept going, oh, it's too expensive, it's too expensive. So what I did is I create this little graph that compares fertilizer versus feeding hay, the cost of fertilizer and the grass that it grows, and versus rolling up or buying hay and feeding it. So what I do here is on the left hand side of this graph, that's $1 per head per day for expense for one cow. And I just used 43 pounds a day, 1,200 pound cow, 70% utilization. We can use any number you want to use. That's just, have to pick one number, and that's what I liked. And so we just use 43 pounds. Really, it doesn't matter. I can show this with any size cow you want to, and it's going to show about the same end of the story. On my right hand side, I've got a cow for 1,000 pound bale. Why 1,000 pound? Because that's what everybody says their hay weighs. And so again, another discussion for another day. And it's over here. So we got different costs all the way from $20 a bale to $50 a bale. And then down here on the bottom is the cost of fertilizer, dollars per ton. Okay. And we're going to look at 50 pounds of nitrogen, actual N. So what happens is when we look at this, so I choose $35 a bale. Okay, that's the cost per head per day to feed that 43 pounds, and it's somewhere just south of $1.20 per head per day. And then this is the cost per head per day to feed 43 pounds of grazed forage. Now notice I put grazed. We're not harvesting this or baling it up, with 50 pounds of nitrogen or 109 pounds of urea, and at $350 a ton. So when that bar, this little orange bar, is below that line, that means it's cheaper to feed the forage. And when I talk about the forage, I'm just talking about the ton that it produces. I'm not talking about anything else, just the extra ton that it produces. So when that bar is below it, means it's cheaper to fertilize. When that bar is above that line, it means it's cheaper to feed hay. And so we're going to look at this. And so does anybody want to shout out? I've got $25 to $40 a bale. Anyone want to shout out what hay prices are going to be this year? Can't see the chat, so someone's got to shout it out and tell me. Y'all pick it. You pick anyone you want to. 35. So let's click on 35. That's our line to match. Okay, so $35 a bale. Here we go. Urea at 350 ton. Still cheaper. 400, 450, 500, 550, 600. What's the price of urea going for these days? Anybody? I know what it is, but I want to see if anybody else knows. Are we close to it? I believe the average price for the southeast part of Oklahoma is right around 580, 590 a ton. A little higher in some places, a little lower in others. So right now, even at $600 a ton, we can still feed fertilized grass cheaper than we can feed a $35 bale of hay. And we just keep on going. What that tells us is urea can get up to $1,000 a ton, and it's still cheaper. If I click on $25 a bale, you can see it has to get to $800 a ton before it's actually more expensive to feed fertilized grass than it is to feed rolled up hay. Okay, so and people just people just don't believe this, but and Brian talks about, he said he uses these graphs all the time, and show people that really I understand. You go and you write that check for that fertilizer and it hurts. It hurts. But if you do the math to it, it'll hurt you in the long run to buy the hay over time. But what about if we don't need, what if we need phosphorus and nitrogen? Okay. So this little graph, and we'll pick $35 a bale again. Urea, I priced at $600 a ton. I'm going to put amount of urea and DAP is what I'm going to use. So DAP is the bottom here, and we're going to fertilize, and we're going to get 50 units of nitrogen and 50 units of phosphorus. Okay. Again, I'm making the assumption that's what we need. So how expensive does DAP have to be at urea at $600 a ton? Right here, DAP has to get to $800 a ton before it's too expensive to use. So again, when people talk to me it's too expensive to fertilize, I always kind of use, if we need the grass. Now I'll back up to my original thought. If we need the grass, it's too expensive not to fertilize than it is to fertilize. So we go to this next chart, and I kind of put things together here. You know, cost per acre. This is using today's price. Well, cost of urea here is $5.57 a ton on my little survey that I do. DAP is $7.30, so we're getting close to that $800 a ton, but we're not there yet. And then potash is $4.63. But if I'm just using urea, it's costing me roughly $36.36 per acre, and I even included a $6 spreading charge in that. And so cost per 1,000 pound bale. Remember, I'm producing 2 tons or a ton per acre, so 2,000 pounds. So that's costing me $18.18 just for urea at today's prices. DAP, on the other hand, it's cost me right at $35 a bale, or per bale. So we're getting close to where DAP may not be. It may be just a little more expensive than what it is. But the thing is, you got to remember, it seems to always happen when urea or when the fertilizer gets expensive, so does hay. And so these may be hard pressed to find that $35 a bale. Now if we need all three, need 60 or 50 pounds of N, P, and K, yeah, then we're getting up to about $42 a bale that way. So again, depending on what your needs, you put a pencil to it. You can do this. So fertilizer can get expensive, but I don't think it's ever more expensive. We bump up to it, but I don't think it ever gets more expensive than we can afford not to do it. I realize there are risks, and Brian's already talked about not enough moisture, not enough for growing conditions. Still, the thing to remember, it's always cheaper to grow the grass than to feed hay. So just pretty much. And one strategy that you can use, and I didn't I'll put that graph in here, but you could, instead of fertilizing all of your pastures, pick that one pasture that you know is really good, produces a lot of grass, double up on the urea and put the 50 pounds of P in there and get an extra 9 tons. So instead of 1 ton, you get 2 tons production, and then use that grass. And it doesn't cost as much as doing 50 pounds of N and 50 pounds of P. That is a strategy that you can use as well to help cheapen that cost. Any questions on fertilizer? So everybody mad, everybody don't believe me when I tell you all this. So now we're going to go to weed control. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. It's, it all depends on the chemical that you're going to need to control the weeds. I do the survey too, and here, the difference between doing 2,4-D versus doing Cimarron Max or Remedy, it's almost double the price or over double the price. And also depends on what you're spraying and stuff, but usually it's somewhere between $7 and $20 an acre. Plus, I always put a $6 per acre. And the reason why I use $6 per acre, if you go to the co-ops and places that do the spraying and spread the fertilizer, that's usually what they charge. It's pretty close, around $6 per acre. So if they're doing it for $6 an acre, chances are it's going to cost you, even if you use your own equipment, pretty close to the same amount. So, you got that fee in there. So somewhere between $13 and $25, $26 an acre is what's going to cost you. So how much weed pressure is it needed to economically justify spraying? The rule of thumb is about 30%. And Brian can answer the weed question better than I can, but that's usually what the rule of thumb I've heard him talk about. It's 30%. So so instead of spraying your fields and trying to figure out a third of your fields, when they need to be sprayed, some producers, to minimize their costs on a yearly basis, will spray just a third of their acreage each year. Typically, when they do that type of rotation, then that minimizes those weed costs or weed spraying costs and helps improve the amount of forage produced as well. And it doesn't break the bank. So that's one rule of thumb that gets used quite a bit. So spread those costs out over all over those acres. So that's all I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about weed spraying. Now we're not going to jump into hay production just a little bit. So again, if you got any questions, keep going, or you better stop and ask me, or I'm going to just keep going. So I like this graph. It really kind of drives home the point. This graph here is the amount of hay produced in Oklahoma tons of, and divided by the number of beef cows in Oklahoma. And you can see here, we start back in 1960, we were producing less than 1 ton of hay per cow. And you get over here to 2020, and we're up to over almost 2.25 tons per, beef per cow. And it really changes right there about 1984. Can anybody think about what happened back about early 80s? Anybody at all? Anybody my age remember what was kind of going on in hay production back in the 80s? Because I can tell you, sort of on my family operation, about 1990 is when it changed for us. We stopped feeding square bales and started going to round bales. It was more convenient. It was easier. I didn't have to pay kids 35 cents a bale to haul it in. Didn't have to, of course, they didn't have to pay me at all. And plus two, 1990, that's when my younger brother graduated high school, actually graduated in 89. And so there was nobody at home to feed the cows. And so dad went to feeding round bales. It was easier on him. So you can see that we've had that switch that, from 1984. So if you look from 1970 to 1984, we produced about 0.87 tons per cow. From 06 to 2020, we're up to 2.25. It's a 158% increase. Why? Bigger cows? I agree with you. Our cows are a lot bigger than they were back in the 70s and 80s, but that doesn't account for all the increase. That doesn't account for the 158%. That might jump it up 10, 20%. We're not going to get into the question, should the cows be bigger? Which size cow is more efficient? Enough? That's a talk for another day. Wasted hay? Okay, when we did square bales, they all went in the barn. Okay, and I'll talk about stored hay in here a little bit. We had very little loss. Round bales couldn't be stored in the barn as easy. We store them outside. We can't feed them as easy, and we feed them, instead of feeding them every day, we feed once every 2 or 3 or 4 days. And so 50% storage losses. So maybe 40% of that is attributed. And then maybe we're going to longer feeding time, 30 to 40, 60 extra days. So we're producing a lot of hay, and we're not being as efficient as we once was. So now we may want to think about trying to be more efficient when we try to produce hay.
Yeah,
so let's talk about hay. Yeah.
Question. I'm not trying to shoot down your theory, but don't we have a half or a third as many cows in Oklahoma as we did in the 60s?
It might be that we divide them by the number of cows each year. So that doesn't. So that 2.25 is per cow based on the number of cows that's in Oklahoma.
Boy, I feel stupid. Thanks.
That's okay. That's okay. So it's real fun to show this graph because people just don't understand that we're probably producing a lot more hay than we ever did, and so we're baling up a lot of grass and feeding the cows when they could possibly be eating it. So standing up. So when we talk about hay production, determining the cost of cutting, raking, and baling is one of the most difficult for producers, and the one that I probably get in the most discussions about when I talk. The reason why I put that warning slide in, because usually there's probably one of you, there's 10 of y'all in this talk today listening to me. There's probably one of you in here that's just going to, JJ, you're wrong. There's no way it costs what you're fixing to tell me it costs. And I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I'm just going to say, put a pencil to it and figure out. And the reason why it's tough, most of this cost is machinery. And so it's not something we pay every year. It's something that we pay when we write the check for that piece of equipment. And then how many years will that piece of equipment last? I mean, if you were my grandfather, we were using the same piece of equipment for 20 years. I don't care how many times we've welded it. I don't know how many times we fixed it. We could have bought it 3 times over, but we made it last as long as we could. So that has an effect on how long it'll last. How many acres you harvested also matters, because let's, if you think about it, if I buy a baler and I only use it on 100 acres per year, yeah, it might last me a little bit longer, and that's another discussion. But my cost per year for that baler is more than somebody who bales 200 acres per year. So that's a hard number to get a hold of. And then average repairs. guys, I don't remember a summer that I wasn't working on some piece of equipment, you know, and you know, there's those years that maybe all the repairs are pretty minimal cost, and then there's those years when it's thousands of dollars to fix it. I mean, think about it. You know, how many times have y'all had the tractor lay down and quit on you, and it's $5,000, $10,000 to fix that thing? And so again, we amortize that over the life of the tractor, but still, it's pretty expensive. And so what I did is I just kind of pulled some costs out of off the internet. I mean, I didn't shop. I didn't be the JJ and go be frugal and find the best deal. I just picked, you know, a tractor at $50,000 that I thought would work, a mower at almost 14,000, a rake at 12,000, and a baler at 35,000. Percentage usage, I'm not going to use that tractor just for a baling, so I guess 25%. That could be probably as high as 50%. I know in my little operation growing up, we had a tractor specifically that's only was used for raking hay, wasn't used in anything else. So life, I just put in 10 years, repairs 10% of the cost, fuel 10%. You can see the annual cost come up to about $8,400. If I put 500 bales on this little cost right here, right there is $17 a bale. Not counting fertilizer, not counting my labor, my time, not counting anything else. I didn't even put interest cost. Just a straight 17 bucks an acre. So, you know, and so that's just, you know, cowboy math and coming up with 16. I think, and I showed this little chart here, I think the harvest costs are more closer to this $25 a bale. And so every year or every couple of years, OSU does a custom machinery survey, and we ask people what they charge to cut, rake, and bale. And the last report that come out, the total cost was right at 27, the average. Now, there's people out there doing it for less, people out there doing it for more. But the average cost to cut, rake, and bale was about $26.75 per bale. Okay. Now I just assume 1,000-pound bales and get 2 bales per acre. Okay. And so if I do you an OSU budget, and we have a machinery cost calculator in our budgets that we can kind of do some rough estimates, it comes up with about the same thing, almost $27 a bale. And that's no labor cost. I put no labor charges, because generally, but most farmers I deal with don't want to put a labor charge in there. And then I went outside to Oklahoma to Farm Docs. It's a website out at University of Illinois, and they did machinery cost calculator for their part of the world, and they come up with $20.60 a bale with no labor cost. So that tells me, just thinking my casual mind, thinking baling costs for hay's got to be somewhere between that $20 to $30 a bale. Okay, and so again, we can cheapen it up if we bale a lot, but it also shortens the life up a little bit. But that's the cost, and that's the cost that generally people choose to ignore. They don't understand what that cost of putting that bale of hay up is. And so I always try to bring this to the forefront. Think about this when you're baling your hay. What is it costing you to bale it? So if we can get away from baling it and do more what Brian says and feed them standing forage, we're saving, $25, $26 per bale. And when you put it on the per cow basis, doesn't come long up to, you're saving a pretty good chunk per cow. If you're feeding, the average cow calf budget that OSU puts out assumes 5 to 6 bales per cow. So right there, it's easy $125 that you're saving per cow if we can get away from feeding them that hay rolled up. Storage is another issue. Yeah, and I hope I don't hurt somebody's feelings when I talk about storage, but and I'm just as bad storing the round bales that I feed my animals. It's really tough to figure out a good way to store it. I usually tend to have a tendency to lean the most convenient way to store it, maybe not the most efficient or best way. And so let's talk a little bit about storage and what that costs us. Okay, and y'all have probably seen these numbers 1,000 times because they haven't changed. I mean, it doesn't matter who does the study. There's a study that Oklahoma did back in the 90s. There's a study that Tennessee did back in 2000. There's studies that other universities have done. All the numbers usually come up pretty close to the same. And if we store this on the ground, and that's where a lot of this hay gets ruined, because it wicks moisture up from the ground. We store it on the ground and we don't cover it up, so now it gets rained on from the top. Average loss, 37%. I can tell you that's probably closer to 50% in some instances. This hay, if it keeps raining the way it's been raining around here, it will be, because we'll have a lot of moisture. And so that 37% means that, if we assume 1,100 pound cow needing 1,290 pounds a month for 4 months, that means if we store that hay grounded on the ground uncovered, we need 8 bales. At $35 bale, that's $286 per cow. If we can just get it up off the ground, okay, and still have it uncovered, okay, we still got to have some loss, but not as much. We drop that down to about 6.5 bales per cow, $255, or save about $32 per cow. If we can get it off the ground and get it covered, okay. In Oklahoma, tarps that's a bad word. In Oklahoma, the wind blows. It's a pain in the butt. I've tried it. We've done our own little study here. But if we can figure out some way to get it off the ground and covered, we drop that from 29% loss to 8% loss. Again, $90 savings. And if we can put it in a barn, depends on how many cows you got. I'm not talking about today's cost of building a barn. When the barn costs get back to normal cost, we probably could pay for a barn in a few years, and not even counting the tax savings that we get from building a barn. But it's tough to build a barn just to store hay in, and we don't have to build a big fancy barn. We can build Quonset huts and different things like that, but we can actually save ourselves some money. I say save ourselves some money, and I kept telling myself when I was looking at this presentation not to say that, because it's really not a savings. You don't see that in dollars in your pocket. What you recognize it is the fact that you don't have to bale as much hay or buy as much hay as you had to in the past. So that's where you see the savings, is your costs are gone down compared to what if you these other storage methods. And so that's just a quick, easy way to save us some money, or to reduce our costs. Hay feeding is another way. Again, we tend to lend more to convenience. The different ways of doing this. So no ring, cheapest way to do it, most easy way to do it. We run out there, we drop it, cut the strings. We may not even cut the strings off of it. Doesn't cost us anything, but we figure the studies have shown that's 45% waste. So extra bales needed per cow, 1.7 bales just by doing that. So $60 a cow cost. If we can just put it in a standard ring, basic hay ring, purchase cost, again, I looked on the internet, anywhere from $200 to $400. I picked an average one, a Tractor Supply, $320. We dropped that waste from 45, drop it by half, 20% waste. We still have quite a bit of waste. Drop that number of bales needed to about 0.8, or about $28 cost. So that $28 per cow, 10 cows, you basically pay for that ring the first year in savings that way. Kind of the new things on the block, the things that a lot of research has been done, and it shouldn't be new. These have been around for 10 years. It seems like it just come around. We can put a sheeted bottom ring, a little more expensive, drop that waste down a little bit more. Now we only need about a half a bale more, $17. Or we can get these basket hay rings, quite a bit more expensive. It drops that waste down. Again, take a little bit longer to pay for these rings, but these rings should have a longer life than those first rings that I showed you. I don't know. I've bought several of those just basic hay rings, and usually I'm lucky to get about 3 years out of them. Sometimes the cows destroy them. These rings right here, I know that there's guys getting 5+ years out of them. So, but again, it's a cost savings that we're really not going to see, but we can use these feeders. Again, it kind of depends on availability to where you can get these. All I'm going to talk about as far as hay versus feeding and storage and stuff like that. Let's switch gears a little bit. Quality versus quantity. Okay. Worked 10 years out in Tennessee working for their extension service, and we always joked out there that you couldn't have a meeting or couldn't do anything around the July 4th holiday, not because of the holiday, because that's when everybody was cutting hay. That was the first 3-day weekend that most people got, and then so they would cut their hay then. And so And then I've had several people talk, when I talk about quality and quantity, they always talk about, well, if I cut it the time that you talk about, I won't get the same amount that I get when I cut it later. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. You know, there's production factors that determine quality, age and maturity, of course, the crop species, environment, variety, and fertility. If we add fertility, we can really affect the quality of that hay. And I'm not going to pretend to be an agronomist. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what I know about. And I stole this from another presentation, and it, you know, the S-shaped curve. When we would really prefer to try to harvest this hay, this is when a lot of people seem to do it. You know, the stage 3, it's draws on energy reserves in the roots. The growth is real slow. It's low quantity, but very high quality. That should be, that's wrong. Oops, back up. I hit the wrong button. Let's see if I can do that. Back up. That's a typo. This should say low quality, high quantity. Shows what happens when you don't proofread your slides. But that's low quality, high quantity type stuff. Stage 1, really high quality, low quantity. Growth is pretty slow, but we'd like to try to hit in the stage 2. We have increased leaf area, traps that sunlight. The growth rate is increasing. Roots are being replenished. It's palatable, it's nutrition, and we can get a little bit of high quantity and high quality. And so we don't want this stage 3. We'd like to try to figure in the stage 2. And so when we put it together, you know, Brian showed a lot of slides about what the crude protein and TDN was for that grass. And so when we group this, we kind of talk about a poor hay being less than 6% crude protein, less than 54% TDN. That's kind of that stage 3. When we went to stage 2, we get that good, you know, crude protein greater than 10%, TDN greater than 59%. The fair kind of falls in between a little bit. But if we look at this and just, again, stole this slide from another presentation, but cattle that are in the mid-3rd gestation, they only need 50% TDN and 7.1% crude protein. We can do that with the fair and especially the good. The last third, we can still do that. But now if we're getting early lactation, a little difficult to do it with maybe some of this hay. But again, if this hay meets these needs and we don't have to feed, so let's say we cut 30 days of feed and supplementation, and I use the average 20% range cube price, and for what range cubes are going for now, if we can save 30 days, we can look at shaving $36 cost off that cow. We can knock it to 45 days, we can get it to $55 per cow, 60 days, 73. And so we can have some significant savings, the savings that we will recognize because we're not have to buy that feed. And all it does stems from is the fact that we went ahead and we put up hay at the right time instead of the most convenient time. Now, again, I understand weather does affect us sometimes. Like this year, I understand that first cutting of hay is probably not going to be the best because we couldn't get in the fields. It was wet. But maybe we get that second cutting to be that good hay. And maybe we mix that good hay with that fair or lower quality hay and still be able to get away from feeding. But how do we know how good our hay is? And this, I talked about soil testing, the first part of this. I'm talking about hay testing now. Guys, it's cheap. $14, you get the crude protein values, you get the TDN values, and your county educator is going to tell you, how you can feed that to the type of cows that you have, or even if you're not doing cows, something else. You can, you'll get some feeding options for $14. You'll know, and it's not real hard to take a sample. Again, most county offices will even actually have the tools that you can borrow and go take the sample and then bring it back to the office, and you'll get the numbers that you need. So again, a real $14 to actually save some money. You couldn't get the same odds at any casino in Oklahoma, so better odds than casinos. When we talk about reducing number of days of feeding, he's already showed this. You can see stockpile Bermuda costing at urea $5.57 a ton, costs us right at $24 a cow per month, whereas hay is going to cost us 45 or 51 bucks. So we can save quite a bit of money, by stockpiling some Bermuda, extending those days that we don't have to feed hay. And so things that we can work there. So he's already showed y'all that. So in the end, you know, feeding makes up more than 60% of the expense for raising cattle. Forage expense makes up almost half of that. So anytime we can do anything to save money in our forages, that's what we should be looking at. Our reduced forage expenses are becoming more efficient, and feeding is one of the easiest ways to reduce costs. So I always put in there, takes money. You ever heard the phrase takes money to make money? So when you think about that high cost of fertilizer today, just look at it, it takes money to make money. So we're actually going to spend some money and we're going to make it back. Don't cut expenses though that make you money. Biggest thing. Machinery costs are the next biggest expense. I will tell you this. I will tell you this little story. When I worked out in Tennessee, when I got kind of between the producer and the husband and the wife, and the wife was liking the fact that I was telling him that he didn't need to own the tractor and stuff. But then he kind of pulled me to the side and said, "JJ, you don't understand that the hay equipment keeps me married, because that way when I get in trouble, I run to the hay field and disappear." So I don't know how to put a dollar amount to that figure, but if we can reduce machinery costs, that's what we need to do. That's the next biggest expense. And there's more than one way. You've heard Brian talk about stockpiling Bermuda grass. You've heard me talk about fertilizing. You've heard about weed spray. You've heard me talk about storage methods, cutting, harvesting the hay, feeding the hay. There's more than one way to do it. Not every way will work for everybody. Each one that I talked about is not the most convenient way to manage your cattle. And so you've got to figure out what fits your management style and what best fits your lifestyle as well. That's going to be the easiest. So just realize that everyone that we've talked about tonight, it's going to require a little bit better than average management to do. So, and with that, guys, that's all I got. That's all, folks. Appreciate everybody showing up and taking time out of your busy Thursday evening. If at all y'all have any questions, or you want us to help you, do anything that we've talked about tonight, that's what we're here for. That's what OSU Extension is here for. Just visit with your county extension educator, and again, that's what and we're all here to help them. We love doing it. So I don't want to speak for Brian Pugh and Frecken, but I think I can say that we do this job because we enjoy it and we really enjoy helping y'all. So if you ever need any help, just only thing I can't do is write the check for you.
Excellent job. I thought that was a great presentation, and yeah, I absolutely love that slide that looks at fertilizer costs versus what it costs to feed a bale of hay. I think it surprises many of us as producers when we look at that, because we get in that mindset that, oh man, fertilizer is $600 a ton, I just can't afford it. But that is a prime example of how sitting down with a sharp pencil and calculating out what it truly costs you per cow per day proves that it's much cheaper to grow it. So I love the whole PowerPoint was great, but that one slide really hits it home for me.
Brian, appreciate it.